calls grow louder to extend a fragile ceasefire and to allow more aid into Gaza. Hamas and Israel have been exchanging detainees and captives now since Friday. But what will it take to keep an agreement like this alive, let alone extend it beyond these 4 days? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, after weeks of intense Israeli bombardment, the people of Gaza are finally enjoying a few days of relative calm. Hamas and Israel are using this time to exchange dozens of detainees and captives as part of that agreement. But that deal hit a snag on Saturday when a disagreement led to several hours of delay in releasing captives. So with a great deal of mistrust on both sides, how do mediators ensure that both Israel and Hamas play their parts? And what are the logistical implications of facilitating such an agreement? Can it be extended beyond the 4 days? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but here's what we know about this deal so far. It involves the release of a total of 50 Israeli captives in exchange for a 4-day ceasefire, which already began on Friday. As part of that agreement, about 150 Palestinian women and children will also be freed from Israeli jails. Humanitarian aid is another critical factor. The deal says about 200 trucks with food, medicine, water, and desperately needed fuel will be allowed into Gaza daily. Israel has also agreed not to fly drones across northern Gaza for 6 hours a day. This deal was mediated by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, but throughout this entire process, mistrust between the two sides has been a challenge. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Geneva, we have Fabrizio Carboni. He's the Near and Middle East Regional Director of the International Committee of the Red Cross. In Rome, Alistair Crooke, a veteran negotiator himself, who's mediated ceasefires between Hamas and Israel in the past too. And in London, we have Nimer Sultany, a reader in public law at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. I want to start about trust, because this whole way that the deal has been structured so far appears to be about building trust. So one side does one thing, the other side responds by releasing another group. So captives are released, then prisoners are released, iteratively. It's a slow process, 1 day at a time. Given what we've seen so far, Alistair, I'm going to start with you. Where is trust at the moment?
There's never trust. You never have a trust. It's not a ceasefire, incidentally. What we're talking about is a hudna or truce. A ceasefire has some legal connotations. But within a truce of this nature, you never have trust. First of all, there's always the problem of who is speaking, who has the mandate. Now, it's probably pretty clear on the Hamas side that it's Sinwar, not the people in Doha. And on the other side, there seem to be a lot of cooks in the kitchen. You described them all. But the greatest problem with any ceasefire is to nail everything down beforehand. And then it's passed over to someone like one of your guests here to try and implement it. But you need to decide. I mean, first of all, even simple things. Who are the people who are going to be exchanged? What are their names? Are they alive or are they dead? In one case, I had to do a negotiation and with Hezbollah. And of course, Hezbollah said, well, we won't give you proof of life because that will cost you. You'll have to release some more hostages in order to get that proof of life. And then you have the details of it, when it's going to take place, what is the ratio? That is the most complicated. In the case of Gilad Shalit, it was 1,200 odd Israeli for one prisoner, Shalit. So these are the main things. And always distrust. And by the way, there's already distrust about today's release. I see that now it's turned around and the Israelis are saying that actually it's Hamas who's not allowing the humanitarian convoys to go to the north. And yesterday it was Hamas who was saying it was Israel not allowing the humanitarian convoys going to the north.
Alistair, you've said a lot there, and I want to dig into all of that. But let me start with the last thing that you've raised, this he said, she said about who's obstructing aid. Let me throw this one to you, Fabrizio. I understand the International Committee of the Red Cross. Obviously, you're involved with dealing with some of the captive releases, but you are, I understand, also dealing with some of the deliveries of medical aid that's taking place in Gaza at the moment. Now, Hamas yesterday was saying something like only 65 of 340 aid trucks that had entered Gaza had actually reached northern Gaza. Hamas was saying that's less than half of what Israel had agreed. Fabrizio, what is the hold-up at the moment? We're obviously hearing different things from both sides.
You know, I will go back to the question of trust, because I think this is key in such an environment. And in this environment, everything is politicized. I would even say that everything is weaponized. And just your question about how many trucks comes in or not, who is responsible or not, is not just, I would say, a neutral question. This is a question and an answer which has consequences. It has consequences on who is respecting or not an agreement. And that's where I think as ICRC, and it's sometimes it's not understood, we need to find this space where we can't be seen as playing this game.
Sure.
And it varies, obviously, from one moment to another into a conflict. The issues varies. But in this moment right now, I think if we agree that for us, the most important thing today is to replace the absence of trust between parties, to allow the deal to take place. And the deals at different dimensions. We talk about the release, we talk about the assistance coming in. And so I think for us, and I repeat, is often misunderstood as not having opinion or not caring. That's not the point. The point today is that in all this crisis, you at least need one actor who shouldn't be permanently in the communication, in the judging, in giving opinion. And if there is a moment where we should, keep this position, is right now.
Well, let me ask you then, Fabrizio, and I obviously understand there are many questions that you can't be drawn on in order for ICRC to be able to do its very important job at the moment. We have been understanding, and we've been hearing from you, that you are being given lists of captives to be released every day. And I want to try to give our viewers here a little bit of an insight into some of the logistics, perhaps, behind this process. So let me perhaps ask you a factual question. At the moment, do you have any clarity at the moment on how many captives there are and who's holding them? Because Hamas initially had said that they weren't sure where they all were, they weren't sure of exact numbers. At this stage, do we have that list?
No, we don't have it. And it's day by day that it works. So every day we have a series of instructions, a series of information on places, on who is going to be released, when, how. But so far we don't have this general overview on who is having who. So it's a day-by-day exercise, which is obviously very complex. So we don't have this overview.
And let me see if I can phrase this in a way that you're able to answer it. Do you have any sense of how the captives are being chosen? Obviously, we know that women and children were part of the deal. So where we're talking about civilian captives at the moment, have you been given any sense of if perhaps those who might need more medical assistance, we've obviously seen a lot of elderly captives being released, if they're being prioritized, have any of those conversations been taking place with the ICRC?
No, and I think this is an important issue, is that we don't have access, especially to the hostages in Gaza. We have no knowledge of their detention condition. We have no knowledge on their well-being. We don't know where they are. We haven't seen them. And we repeatedly asked to see them, visit them since, I think, day one. So for the time being, we are working in an environment which I would call not optimal. And, you know, we are a humanitarian organization. We are not a logistic organization. And so for us, it's sometimes very difficult to only do part of our humanitarian work. And today, we do part of our humanitarian work because we cannot visit, we cannot provide proof of lives to the family. And also, by the way, on the Israeli side, we're not allowed to visit anymore the place of detention. So we do our best in a very politicized environment, nothing to do with humanitarian action. We try, nevertheless, to preserve as much as we can a humanitarian space.
Okay, thank you for that, Fabrizio. I want to throw a question to Nimer, because we've been talking a lot here about trust. Obviously, trust was pretty hard to find to even get to this point. But as we see both sides continue to point the finger at each other in terms of I guess, smaller violations of what's perceived to be the deal, where is your assessment of where trust is? Could something as small as a blame game that we're seeing go on daily at the moment, could that derail the process? Or would it just potentially or stop the idea of an extension of the ceasefire?
Well, obviously, the question of trust in the midst of a genocidal campaign against an essentially civilian population is hard to find. So the question of ceasefire is, broken down to a kind of instrumental element in a wider kind of situation of onslaught. If you remember in the what's the so-called protective edge operation in 2014, we had a situation of 17 ceasefires during 50 days of military activity. And today, the question is this a short-term ceasefire or is it a long-term ceasefire? And the Israelis obviously made it clear that it is a short-term ceasefire. The way I see it, there are three main challenges to the ceasefire holding up. The first one, obviously, that this ceasefire from the Israeli side does not include any cessation of hostile military activity in the West Bank. And we have at least 6 Palestinians who were killed by Israeli raids in the past few days, since the ceasefire started. And we need to remember here the context of that set off the outbreak of violence on the 7th of October, which is that there was a violation of the status quo in Al-Aqsa and religious sites by the far-right Zionist activists, including members of the Israeli government, as well as the thousands of prisoners who are languishing for decades in Israeli prisons. And thirdly, the pogroms and the settlers' violence in the West Bank. So if these things continue, obviously that will contribute to the fragility of any ceasefire arrangement. And then secondly, we have heard from the beginning of the ceasefire from the Israeli side, specifically the Minister of Defense, that they intend for this to be a short-term arrangement in which they continue what is essentially a one-sided onslaught in a situation of a gross asymmetry of power between the two sides. And what exacerbates these issues is that we are in a situation that is somewhat reminiscent of the 1967 war inside Israel, in the sense that we have a weak political leadership, and the Israeli army generals are the ones who are actually setting the tone. And behind them, there is a total mobilization of society, a society in war, with unrealistic goals of eliminating Hamas, which became a cover for a genocidal campaign. And the third element, I would say, for the ceasefire holding up is whether the U.S., who has been the main blockage for a ceasefire resolution in the UN Security Council, will finally respond to the civilized world's demand that the genocidal campaign in Gaza stops.
Nimer, I want to get into the diplomacy in just a moment, but let me pick up on something you said there. You were talking about this ongoing crackdown that we've seen, too, in the occupied West Bank. We've seen escalating arrests since October the 7th, thousands and thousands of people. Now, also, depending on how the next few days play out, we've already seen arrests over the last 2 days. The number of people detained by Israel over the course of this 4-day ceasefire could actually end up exceeding the number of people released, depending on how it all goes, obviously. How is this deal at the moment being viewed in the occupied West Bank? Is this, I mean, it's obviously not a violation of the ceasefire because the ceasefire covers Gaza, but is it perhaps a violation of trust?
Well, as you said, the difficulty with the language of ceasefire, it obscures a situation of occupation. As the ICRC and other UN and legal authorities have repeatedly said since 2005, the so-called disengagement plan, that Gaza continues to be an occupied territory. And only recently, December last year, the UN General Assembly referred the situation of the legality of Israeli control over the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So, and the problem with that is that the ceasefire language obscures the obligations of the occupying power towards the people of Gaza and the West Bank and the rest of the occupied territories, including medical and food supplies. So now the ceasefire arrangement is the one in which the Palestinians in Gaza are able to allow humanitarian relief, allow medical and food supplies, even though even in the more generalized situation, it is Israel, in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, that should be allowing that kind of access unimpeded. In fact, only a few years ago, in 2018, the UN Security Council decided that starvation and the unlawful denial of humanitarian access cannot be a permissible tool of warfare.
Well, we've had a number of different aid agencies and UN agencies also criticize the use of starvation as potentially being used as a weapon of war in this case. I just want to get back to some of the nitty-gritty parts of this deal and just how it might evolve over the course of the next 48 hours or so. Alistair, I wanted to ask you a little more about something you mentioned earlier, this ratio that we've seen so far. 3-to-1 in terms of Palestinian prisoners for Israeli captives. So obviously, as I was saying, women and children being released on both sides so far. These are presumably easier captives to have a negotiation about, the women and children. When we get to men, when we get to soldiers, could that ratio change? You talked about the huge ratio in the Gilad Shalit case, which you were involved in, more than 1,000 to 1. Are those conversations taking place right now for what might happen after these releases over 4 days, if they do continue?
No, they're not. And I just want to go back and say we need to talk about two different things. Really, we say, that this is not, a political exercise. The IRGC has a very difficult, the Red Cross has a very difficult role of trying to be sort of in the middle of this. But of course, this is highly political in the sense that both sides are trying to use every element for psychological advantage, to come out and look as if they won this exercise. And this is behind a lot of these problems that we get when they can be minor problems. And I just want to make it clear, of the ceasefires I did, I mean, most of them failed. One of them failed just on a statement by one person, and the whole thing collapsed. Another one was a car bomb going off during the ceasefire. And that was a ceasefire, not a hudna. And the point about this is, there are 3 open fronts, at least at the moment, facing Israel. And my lesson from doing these hudnas was always, you can't have, if you like, quiet in one place. You can't have quiet in Bethlehem, and you have war going on in Hebron or Khalil or some other part of the territories. It doesn't work like that. And so you have the West Bank, which is really on a knife's edge at the moment. And always in these hudnas, you have a group or an element that is not in favor of the hudna continued. Yes, the world as a whole may be in favor of this and turning it from a hudna into a ceasefire with some legal, and go back to the legal underpinnings to it. But there are also people, and we know that in Israel, who don't want it to continue because they want to get back to the war on Gaza. And they know that the longer this goes on, the harder it is to start that war again. And they're committed to restarting it. So I think always my feeling was that this was going to be a very short-lived truce. It may go on for 4 days. It may have an extra day or so, but that will be very lucky if we get that far.
Do you expect to see any further prisoner or captive releases beyond what's already been agreed? You say those discussions aren't taking place at the moment. There has obviously been hope that might happen.
Well, there will be pressure from the families, at least to try and get all the children and the women out. But when it comes to the men, many of whom are military or from the settlements, being trained by the IDF, then it's a completely different ballgame, and then it is all for all in the terms of Hamas, i.e. all Israel's prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, of which there are about 6,000 plus, in return for their holdings of the male, some of them military, including some of them very senior military hostages that they're holding in Gaza.
And we have heard from Hamas that they were expecting more senior figures to have been released over the course of the last couple of days. I understand there were people released who were only just weeks from the end of their prison terms, but they're being counted as part of that number. Let me go back to you, Fabrizio, because you've been very hands-on with this, and obviously you're dealing with a huge amount of tension, with holding a very fragile ceasefire there and trying to facilitate these releases and the aid going in as well. This is all being monitored, I understand, by an operations centre that's being managed by Qatar. And this is all supposed to be happening in real time. There are supposed to be representatives of both sides involved in this. How is that working or not working?
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated choreography. You have many moving parts which condition one and the other. So, yeah, we have many colleagues embedded or in close contact with the different part of this deal, and we need to make sure that we move according to what is agreed. So it's complex, and it's happening in an environment of violence, distrust, and also a dramatic humanitarian environment. I think, we're talking about releasing people, women and children, in a place, Gaza, which is devastated, which is scared, because, as you said, it's a pause. It's 3, 4, 5 days, and then what? So it's emotionally also very loaded. It's also very tense, because we don't do that in a vacuum. We do that in Gaza, surrounded by people who are really struggling every day to stay alive. So I think that while this focus on the release is important, because it's an important humanitarian issue, and at the same time, we shouldn't lose perspective on the bigger picture, which is the 6 weeks of unbelievable violence, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, affected, and you mentioned it, there is also the West Bank. And what is really hard for us as humanitarian is it's not over.
Yeah.
And we have a hard time, and I'm talking from the field perspective, not from my comfortable office in Geneva. I mean, where do we go? What's the end game of all this disaster? So it's a bittersweet.
I want to ask exactly that question that you've just posed, Fabrizio, to Nimer, because, as you say, during these 4 days, we're getting a bit more of an opportunity now with a slightly better ease of movement within Gaza to see the full extent of the destruction that's taking place. And I've been wondering whether seeing that being documented, Nimer, is that changing perceptions or pressure on Israel to not only explain its end game, but also potentially change the way that it conducts this war if it all does resume in the course of the next couple of days?
Allow me first to make a comment on Mr. Crooke's repeated use of the word hudna. I don't think using the word hudna is useful in this context. I think it only mystifies the issues at hand. We could have used the Hebrew word hafuga, And the use of the word hudna here merely obscures the context, mystifies it, and make it look as if it's
sorry,
exotic.
gentlemen, I don't want to get into a semantics here because I don't want us to run out of time talking about this. So just to clarify for our viewers, hudna is a term that is often used, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, by Hamas for an extended ceasefire of sorts, a phase within a broader phase that could at some point lead to some kind of reconciliation. So let's at this point talk about what may be to come rather than focusing necessarily just on the word.
Yeah, I mean, the word is ceasefire, and we need to be using this word rather than make it look a little bit kind of more unable to explain the exact situation. And it's in terms of your question with respect to the Israeli use of virtually unlimited infliction of suffering on civilians in the Gaza in particular, but also on the West Bank. The main problem is impunity. So there have been different campaigns in the past in which Israel also violated international law in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and there was no repercussions. There were no consequences. There was no accountability, despite the well-documented violation of international law by different human rights organizations as well as the UN. So that's the first issue here. That is, international law and international legal institutions are now suffering a major setback in terms of any form of credibility, but also the fact that Western powers such as the US, the UK, Germany, but also the EU are seen as enablers and complicit in the genocidal campaign that Israel is inflicting on Gaza. And so long as there is no more pressure being exercised over Israel, we will see that even the southern part of Gaza being exposed to the same kind of horrendous
Nimer, I'm going to jump in here. Yeah. I'm sorry, because I do want to ask Alistair one more question around what we've been discussing in terms of what might happen after these 4 days and also in terms of existing international pressure. Because one of the things that we've talked about a lot is what other parties are doing, but we haven't spoken a great amount about the agency of the Palestinian people, the people in Gaza themselves. And Alistair, as someone who's been a negotiator, who's been involved in a lot of these processes, at the moment, is there a sense of who might be the Palestinian representative of the people, not necessarily of a different political faction, but of the people of Gaza sitting at that table in terms of trying to define their own future? Is there a conversation about that? Just very, very briefly.
Yes. If you've seen the videos, I mean, it was so striking. The energy, the resourcefulness, the sense of solidarity when the prisoners, the Palestinian prisoners, were received in the West Bank. I think we are seeing something very different. And let's not forget, this is also being seen by the rest of the Islamic world, and it's changing it. Yes, it is changing it. It is creating a sense of cohesion, of communal effort. It is creating also a sense of a national project and an Islamic project together. The two have been separate for a long time, and now we're seeing them come together in a very powerful way.
And we'll see how those dynamics play out in the coming days and weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much for joining me here on Inside Story, gentlemen. Alistair Crooke, Fabrizio Carboni and Nimer Sultany. And Fabrizio, we really wish you and the ICRC all the best with your work. Thank you, too, for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here. Bye for now.